The heavy, iron-wrought doors of the sanctum of veils groaned open, releasing a scent of ancient incense and cold, pressurized ambition. This was the night of the Vampire King's unexpected choice, a night where bloodlines were bartered and destinies were sold to the highest bidder. Before we dive into the shadows of the High Court, I want to say a heartfelt hello to all of you joining us today. Whether you're watching from the rainy streets of London, the bustling heart of New York, or somewhere quiet under the stars, I'm so glad you're here. How are you all doing today? If you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and join our community. It truly means the world to us and helps these stories reach more souls like yours. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I'd love to see how far our family reaches. Killian Sullivan stood on the obsidian dais, his silhouette a jagged blade against the flickering torchlight. As the sovereign of the Shadow Throne, his very presence commanded a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight on the lungs of every noble in the hall. His chest felt tight, not from the corset of his royal regalia, but from the suffocating expectation of the council. They wanted a queen, a political chess piece from a great house to solidify his reign. Killian, however, wanted only to be left to his ghosts. His eyes, the color of a winter sea before a storm, scanned the line of women below. They were draped in silks, dripping in jewels, their scents a cacophony of expensive perfumes and practiced desperation. They were perfect human specimens bred and groomed for this moment. To Killian they were nothing more than vultures in lace. "The council demands a selection, Your Majesty," a voice hissed beside him. The Archduke, a man whose ambitions smelled like rotting lilies. "The bloodlines must be fortified. Choose the daughter of House Valerius. Or perhaps the Lady Alara. They are the jewels of the season." Killian's lip curled. He didn't want a jewel. He wanted a shield against their interference. If he chose a woman of high standing, he'd be married to her father's agenda and her brother's greed. He needed someone invisible. Someone so plain, so unremarkable, that the council would lose interest in his domestic life entirely. He needed a mistake that would grant him peace. His gaze drifted past the center stage toward the very end of the line, where the shadows of the pillars swallowed the light. There, standing slightly apart from the shimmering displays of beauty, was a figure draped in a heavy charcoal-gray cloak. Unlike the others, she didn't tilt her chin to catch the light. She didn't offer a practiced smile. She stood with a stillness that was almost unnatural, her head bowed, her features obscured by a thick opaque lace veil that looked more like a funeral shroud than a bridal accessory. The scent coming from her wasn't perfume. It was something raw, like crushed herbs, rain-soaked earth, and a faint metallic tang that made the predatory instinct in Killian's gut twitch. "Her," Killian said, his voice a low vibration that rattled the crystal chandeliers. The Archduke froze. "Sire? That is a stray. A commoner brought in to fill the numbers. She has no lineage, no dowry. She is by all accounts quite homely and insignificant. Surely you jest." "I do not jest," Killian replied, his heart hammering a rhythm of defiance. "I choose the girl in gray. Unveil her." The room erupted into a scandalized murmur. The noble ladies gasped behind their fans. The lords exchanged looks of mocking pity. The king had chosen the ugly chick of the auction. He had chosen the plainest, most discarded woman in the room to sit beside him on the throne. Killian felt a grim sense of satisfaction. He had won. He had silenced them all with a choice so disappointing they would surely leave him in solitude. But as the high priest stepped forward, his skeletal fingers reaching for the heavy lace veil, the air in the room suddenly turned cold. A hum, low and vibrating at a frequency that made Killian's fangs ache, began to emanate from the woman. The priest gripped the fabric and pulled. The veil didn't just fall, it seemed to dissolve into the air like mist. And as the gray fabric fluttered to the floor, the mocking laughter in the hall died a sudden violent death. Killian Sullivan, a man who had lived 1,000 years and seen the rise and fall of empires, felt his breath hitch. The woman standing before him wasn't the plain commoner he had envisioned. She was a vision of ethereal, haunting radiance. Her skin had the glow of moonlight on fresh snow, and her eyes, wide amber and swirling with an ancient forbidden fire, locked onto his with a ferocity that burned through his defenses. But it wasn't just her beauty that caused the silence. It was the mark on her throat, a shimmering violet sigil that began to pulse in sync with Killian's own heartbeat. "What have you done?" the Archduke whispered, backing away in terror. Killian couldn't answer. He couldn't move. He had tried to pick a woman who would mean nothing, but as the mysterious aura exploded from her, shaking the foundations of the sanctum, he realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline. He hadn't chosen a pawn. He had just unveiled a legend. And now the hunt for their lives was about to begin. The silence in the sanctum was no longer a sign of respect. It was the heavy, suffocating weight of a room full of predators realizing they were in the presence of something they couldn't control. Killian Sullivan didn't blink. He couldn't. His gaze was anchored to the woman whose name, according to the auction ledger, was Clara Huntington. Clara stood with a poise that defied her supposed commoner status. Her amber eyes weren't filled with the terror typical of human brides sold to the vampire nobility. Instead, they held a simmering defiance, a depth of soul that suggested she had survived far worse than a royal auction. As she stood there, the pulse of the violet sigil on her neck cast a faint rhythmic glow against the curve of her jaw. Killian felt a strange magnetic pull toward her, a sensation he hadn't felt in centuries. Since the Great War that had claimed his family and left him with the cold, lonely crown of the Shadow Throne, he had operated on logic and survival. His deepest desire was simple: to preserve his people without losing his soul to the corruption of the council. But seeing Clara, a flicker of something long dormant, a primal need for a true equal, ignited in his chest. "Who are you?" Killian's voice was a low rasp intended only for her. "Someone you should have left in the shadows, Your Majesty," Clara replied. Her voice was like velvet over gravel, rich and textured. There was no sire or my lord. She spoke to him as if they were standing on a battlefield, not a dais. Beside the king, the Archduke's face had turned a sickly shade of gray. "This is impossible. The mark of the Ethelgard. It hasn't been seen in 3 millennia. She is a descendant of the Sunwalkers. Sire, she is a threat to everything we have built." As the council members began to rise, their fangs baring and eyes glowing crimson with a mix of fear and greed, Killian stepped forward, closing the distance between him and Clara. He caught the scent of her again, not just herbs and rain, but an underlying note of something celestial, something that tasted like lightning. Clara didn't flinch as the king's shadow fell over her. She looked up at him, her lips parting slightly. "You thought you were choosing a ghost to hide behind," she whispered, her eyes searching his. "But you've pulled a flame into a house made of dry wood." Killian reached out, his gloved hand hovering near her cheek. He could feel the heat radiating from her skin, a warmth that felt like a mockery to his cold, immortal existence. "I have spent my life controlling the fire," he murmured. "I think I can handle one woman." "I am not just a woman," she countered, her hand coming up to touch the mark on her neck. "And you are not the only one with secrets, King Sullivan." Behind them, the great hall was descending into chaos. The Lady Ilara, who had expected to be the chosen one, was weeping with rage, while the lords of the minor houses whispered of rebellion. To them, Killian hadn't just made a mistake. He had brought a legendary weapon into the heart of their city. Killian looked out at the faces of his court. Men like Julian Beaufort, a high-ranking officer with a reputation for cruelty, and Sophie Thorne, a strategist who saw every person as a pawn. They weren't looking at Clara as a queen. They were looking at her as a prize to be dissected or a danger to be eliminated. In that moment, Killian knew his plan for a quiet, unremarkable life was dead. He looked back at Clara, seeing the flicker of vulnerability beneath her defiance. She was alone in a den of monsters, and despite the power humming in her blood, she was still human, fragile in ways he had forgotten. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of empathy. She hadn't asked for this. She had been hiding, trying to survive just like he had been. "I don't care about your lineage or your legends," Killian declared, his voice booming to silence the room once more. He wrapped a protective arm around Clara's waist, pulling her flush against his side. The contact was electric, a jolt of pure energy that made his vision sharpen. "She is my choice. She is the queen of the Shadow Throne. Anyone who challenges her presence here challenges me." As he led her off the dais and toward the private royal chambers, the Archduke's eyes narrowed. The political landscape of the vampire kingdom had just shifted on its axis. Killian was determined to find out what Clara really was, but as they walked through the darkened corridors, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being hunted. He was a king who had spent centuries avoiding the heart's complications, but as Clara's hand brushed against his, he realized he was already losing that battle. Before we move into the moment where everything changes, I have to ask, what do you think that violet mark really means? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you're enjoying the tension, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the reveal of Clara's true. The heavy oak doors of the royal suite slammed shut, muffling the chaotic roars of the council, but the silence inside was even more volatile. Killian Sullivan paced the length of the room, his cape snapping behind him like a dark wing. He turned to face Clara Huntington, who stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers dancing in her amber eyes. "The mark of Ethelgard," Killian started, his voice low and dangerous. "That mark is a death sentence in this court, Clara. My people spent centuries hunting down the Sunwalkers because their blood is the only thing that can truly unmake a vampire king. And you walked into my auction wearing it like a necklace." Clara didn't tremble. She reached up, slowly unfastening the clasp of her gray cloak, letting it heavy thud to the floor. "I didn't walk in, Killian. I was sold. My village was raided by your recruiters 3 weeks ago. I stayed hidden in the shadows, praying to be the one nobody noticed. I've spent 22 years pretending to be nothing, breathing softly so the world wouldn't hear my heart beat. And then you, the great king, decided to play a game of spite with your council and picked the ugly chick in the corner." She stepped closer to him, the heat of her body colliding with the chill of his. "You didn't choose a shield. You chose the very thing your enemies will use to destroy you." Killian reached out, his fingers catching her chin. The touch was agonizingly sharp. It felt like a static shock that traveled straight to his core. He saw her pupils dilate, the golden rings in her eyes swirling. The attraction was a physical blow, a magnetic force that defied the centuries of ice around his heart. "They will have to get through me first," he growled. But the moment of shared vulnerability was shattered by a violent crash. The balcony's floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows exploded inward. Shards of colored glass rained down like lethal confetti. Before Killian could shield Clara, 3 figures clad in midnight black tactical gear, not the silks of the court but the leather of mercenaries, swung into the room on rappelling lines. "The king is compromised," one of the attackers shouted. He didn't use a sword. He drew a high-tension crossbow loaded with a bolt tipped in shimmering silver. "Secure the Sunwalker. Kill the sovereign." Killian's fangs descended, his eyes bleeding into a terrifying abyssal black. He moved with a speed that blurred the air, catching the first mercenary by the throat and hurling him through the stone wall. But these weren't ordinary guards. They moved with a synchronized grace that suggested they weren't just vampires. They were augmented. "Clara, get behind the desk," Killian roared. But Clara didn't hide. As a second attacker lunged at her with a silver-edged blade, she didn't scream. She instinctively threw her hands up. The violet sigil on her neck flared with a blinding, ultraviolet brilliance. A shock wave of pure, solar energy erupted from her palms, throwing the mercenary back across the room with such force that his armor shattered. The air smelled of ozone and scorched ozone. Killian froze, staring at the woman he had thought was a plain commoner. She was gasping, her hands trembling as white-hot smoke curled from her fingertips. The power hadn't just protected her. It had responded to her fear with the strength of a collapsing star. The third attacker, seeing the display, didn't continue the fight. He pressed a hand to his ear. "She's awakened. Phase 2. Now." He threw a flashbang canister at their feet. Boom. White light blinded Killian. His sensitive hearing rang with a high-pitched whine. He lunged through the smoke, his hands searching for Clara, his heart hammering against his ribs in a way it hadn't for an eternity. He found her arm, pulling her toward the secret passage behind the tapestry just as the room was flooded by the Archduke's personal peacekeepers. They weren't there to save them. They were there to contain the threat. "We have to go," Killian hissed, pulling her into the damp, dark safety of the stone tunnels. "The council isn't just angry, Clara. They've been waiting for a reason to stage a coup. They sent those men to ensure you were unveiled to the world so they could justify killing us both." As they hurried through the labyrinthine passages beneath the castle, the weight of the revelation settled over them. Killian had wanted to avoid drama, but he had accidentally triggered an ancient prophecy. The ugly chick was the most powerful weapon in existence, And the king who was supposed to be her master was now her only protector. "Why are you helping me?" Clara whispered as they paused for air in a dripping cavern. "You're a vampire. My blood is poison to you." Killian looked at her. Really looked at her. Seeing the girl who had been discarded by the world now holding the power to end it. "Because for the first time in 500 years, he said, his voice raw with a truth he wasn't ready to admit, "I'm not bored." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. "And because I think I've been waiting for someone to burn this whole house down anyway. Before we find out if they can make it out of the city alive, I want to know. If you were in Clara's shoes, would you trust the king who accidentally bought you or would you run? Tell me in the comments. And make sure you're subscribed. The next part involves a betrayal that none of you will see coming." The damp walls of the subterranean tunnels seemed to pulse with the rhythm of their frantic breathing. Killian Sullivan led Clara Huntington through the darkness, his hand a firm, grounding weight on her wrist. Above them, the muffled echoes of the castle's alarm bells rang, a hollow metallic tolling that signaled the start of a civil war. "The tunnels lead to the old cathedral ruins on the outskirts," Killian whispered, his eyes scanning the shadows with predatory precision. "From there we can disappear into the Blackwood Forest. They won't follow us there, it's haunted by things even my kind fear." As they moved, the initial shock of the attack began to settle into a thick, simmering tension. Every time their shoulders brushed in the narrow passage, a spark of that strange ultraviolet energy crackled between them. Clara's presence was like a low-frequency hum in Killian's blood, making his instincts scream not just to protect her, but to possess her. It was a hunger unlike any he had ever known, one that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with her soul. "You're shaking," Killian noted, his voice softening. He stopped by a small alcove where a trickle of water ran down the stone. "I just blew a man across a room with light from my hands, Killian," Clara snapped, though her voice wavered. She leaned against the cold stone, her face pale. "I spent my whole life being told I was unlucky and plain. My aunt used to tell me to keep my head down so the world wouldn't notice how unpleasant I was to look at. And now I'm some kind of ancient weapon." Killian stepped into her space, his tall frame casting a long shadow over her. He reached out not with the coldness of a king, but with a surprising gentleness, and tucked a stray lock of her dark hair behind her ear. "They lied to you, Clara. They didn't tell you that you were plain because it was true. They told you that to keep you from realizing you were a sun in a world of moths." Clara looked up at him, her breath hitching. In the dim light, Killian's features were less like a monster and more like a fallen angel. Striking, tragic, and dangerously handsome. "And what are you, Killian?" "A moth." "I am the king of the moths," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips. "And I have never seen a light I wanted to touch more." The moment was interrupted by the sound of splashing water and heavy boots. Not from behind them but from the path ahead. "They're ahead of us," Killian hissed, pulling Clara back into the shadows. "The council must have anticipated this route. Julian Beaufort knows these tunnels as well as I do." Suddenly, a group of guards emerged from the gloom, but they weren't wearing the royal colors. They wore the crest of House Thorne. Leading them was Sophie Thorne, the court strategist Killian had once trusted. "Killian, stop!" Sophie shouted, raising a hand. She didn't look like she wanted a fight, she looked terrified. "The Archduke has declared you a traitor. He's telling the people you've been bewitched by a Sunwalker and that you're planning to sacrifice the city to bring back the Ethelgard Empire. And you believe him, Sophie?" Killian stepped out, shielding Clara. "It doesn't matter what I believe," Sophie replied, her eyes darting to Clara. "The city is in flames. Julian has taken the army. He's hunting you and he has a weapon, something the council has been hiding in the vaults. A Star-Eater blade. It's designed to drain the light from a Sunwalker and the life from a king." Sophie stepped forward, handing Killian a small iron key. "There's a safe house in the ruins. Go there. I'll try to misdirect Julian's scouts, but you have to move fast. Killian, if you truly care for her, don't let them take her. If they harvest her blood, none of us will survive the night." As they fled deeper into the night, the forest air began to bite at them. They reached the ruins, a skeletal remains of a Gothic cathedral, and found the hidden cellar. Inside, the silence was deafening. Killian turned to Clara, the adrenaline finally fading to reveal a raw, aching vulnerability. If Sophie is right, the entire kingdom is looking for us. I came here to find a wife I could ignore, Clara. I didn't expect. You didn't expect to find someone who makes you feel alive? Clara finished, stepping into his arms. Killian didn't hesitate this time. He pulled her against him, his lips meeting hers in a desperate, hungry kiss. It was fire and ice, a collision of two worlds that should never have met. As the power from her mark hummed against his skin, Killian felt a surge of hope he hadn't felt in centuries. But even as they held each other, the ground began to tremble. Outside, the baying of hounds, vampire bloodhounds, rent the air. Julian Beaufort had found them, and he hadn't come alone. Before we move into the midpoint where the ultimate betrayal is revealed, I want to ask you. Do you think Sophie Thorne is really an ally, or is she leading them into a trap? Drop your thoughts below. And if you want to see if Killian can protect his queen, make sure you've hit that subscribe button. The cellar air, thick with the scent of damp earth and centuries of prayer, seemed to freeze as the baying of the hounds grew closer. Killian Sullivan broke the kiss, his forehead resting against Clara Huntington's, his breath coming in ragged hitches. The connection had been more than physical. It was as if their very essences had recognized one another. I won't let them have you, Killian whispered, his voice a vow that resonated in the small stone room. Killian, wait, Clara said, her voice trembling as she pulled back slightly. Her hand went to the violet sigil on her neck, which was now glowing with a frantic, stuttering light. The power. It's not just a defense. I can feel them. Not just the soldiers. I can feel the Archduke. He's not just looking for a sunwalker. Before she could explain, the heavy cellar door was blown off its hinges with a deafening crack of dark magic. Standing at the top of the stairs wasn't the brute Julian Beaufort, but the Archduke himself, flanked by a squad of elite guard. He held a long obsidian blade that seemed to drink the very light from the room, the Star Eater. Move away from the girl, Killian, the Archduke said, his voice calm, almost bored. You've played your part perfectly. Killian stood, his fangs baring, his body coiled to spring. I am your king, Valerius. Step back or I will tear your heart from your chest. The Archduke actually laughed, a cold, dry sound. I, king? You were a placeholder, Killian. A grieving, weary soldier we put on the throne to keep the seat warm while we prepared for the great harvest. Do you really think it was an accident that this girl was at the auction? Do you think it was a coincidence that you, in your predictable arrogance, chose the one plain woman in the room? Killian's heart went cold. What are you talking about? I planted her there, the Archduke sneered, stepping down into the cellar. I knew your psychological profile better than you knew yourself. I knew you'd try to spite us by picking the most overlooked human. I made sure Claire was the one you saw. I made sure she looked ugly and common to your bored eyes. Clara gasped, her back hitting the wall. You orchestrated the raid on my village? I did, the Archduke confirmed. We needed a sunwalker whose powers were dormant but potent. And we needed a vampire king of the Sullivan bloodline to awaken her through the mating bond. The mark only flares when the two polar opposites, the purest shadow and the purest light, connect. That kiss just now? That was the final key. Killian felt a wave of nausea. His rebellion, his choice, his love. It had all been scripted by the very man he thought he was outsmarting. He wasn't the player, he was the pawn. The Star Eater blade needs both of you, the Archduke continued, raising the obsidian sword. It requires the heart of a king and the soul of a sunwalker to unlock the eternal night. You didn't find your destiny, Killian. You walked right into your execution. Suddenly, Clara's amber eyes flared with a terrifying white-hot intensity. The ground beneath the cathedral ruins began to crack. You think I'm just a key? She screamed. The power that had been a hum was now a roar. The violet sigil didn't just glow. It bled light like a dying star. The Archduke lunged, but Clara didn't move away. She moved toward him, her hand catching the obsidian blade with her bare palm. The smell of burning flesh filled the room, but she didn't flinch. The blade began to crack under the pressure of her light. Killian, run, she cried out, her voice echoing with 1,000 ancestors. He's right, the bond is the key, but he forgot one thing. The bond works both ways. In that moment, Killian realized the depth of the trap. If he stayed, the Archduke would use their connection to trigger a cataclysm. If he left, Clara would be alone against a god-slaying blade. The stakes had never been higher. The man who wanted to be invisible was now the only thing standing between the world and an endless darkness. Before we see if Killian chooses his life or his love, I have to know. How would you feel if you found out your entire romance was a setup? Could you ever trust that person again? Let me know in the comments. And if you're holding your breath, hit that subscribe button. The darkest hour is just beginning. The cathedral ruins groaned as the sheer force of Clara's awakening light collided with the Archduke's dark sorcery. Killian Sullivan lunged forward, his fingers inches from Clara's, but the Archduke slammed the hilt of the Star Eater into the stone floor. A shock wave of pure shadow erupted, a physical wall of obsidian energy that threw Killian backward, pinning him against the crumbling altar. No! Killian roared, his strength failing as the blade began to drain the very essence of his royal blood from the room. The bond is a tether, Killian, the Archduke hissed, his face twisted in a mask of triumph. And I am simply cutting the cord. With a brutal twist of his wrist, the Archduke channeled the void through the blade. The connection Killian felt, the warmth, the light, the sudden sense of purpose, was violently severed. It felt as if his soul were being ripped in two without a blade ever touching his skin. Clara let out a soul-shattering scream as she was hauled away by the elite guards, her light flickering and then dying out like a smothered flame. The Archduke stood over the weakened king, looking down with icy disdain. You were always too emotional for this crown, Killian. You thought you were protecting her? You were the one who led us right to her heart. As the guards dragged Clara into the night, Killian tried to rise, but his limbs felt like lead. The darkest hour had truly arrived. He was alone in the wreckage of his own hubris. His kingdom was gone, his power was fading, and the woman who had brought him back to life was being carried off to become a battery for an eternal nightmare. Killian slumped against the cold stone, the silence of the ruins more painful than the screams of the battle. He had spent centuries avoiding attachment, and the one time he had opened his heart, it had been used as the primary weapon against him. He felt the cold creep of despair. The council had won. He had lost everything. His dignity, his throne, and the only person who had looked at him and seen the man beneath the monster. Clara. He whispered into the dust, his voice breaking. He could still feel the phantom heat of her hand in his, a cruel reminder of what he had allowed to happen. Outside, the first signs of the eternal night began to bleed across the horizon. A strange, sickly purple eclipse that signaled the beginning of the end. Is it truly over for our king? Can a heart once broken find the strength to beat again when all light has been extinguished? This is the moment where hope seems like a fairy tale. Tell me in the comments, do you think Killian can find his way back from this, or has the Archduke truly won? Don't forget to subscribe to see if the Shadow King can rise from the ashes. The shadows in the ruined cathedral didn't just feel like darkness anymore. They felt like a shroud. Killian Sullivan lay amongst the shattered stone, the silence of the forest pressing in on him. He could feel his heartbeat slowing. The Star Eater blade had left a void in his chest that no amount of royal blood could fill. For a long moment he considered staying there, letting the dust reclaim him. If he was just a pawn, if his feelings were just a calculated result of a master plan, then what was the point of a king? But then he saw it. Lying in the dirt where Clara Huntington had been dragged away was the heavy charcoal-gray cloak she had worn at the auction. It was tattered, stained with the soot of the explosion, but as Killian reached out a trembling hand to touch it, he didn't feel the cold of the Archduke's shadow. He felt a lingering, stubborn warmth. Suddenly, a memory that wasn't his own flashed through his mind, a side effect of the severed bond. He saw Clara as a young girl hiding in a cellar much like this one, watching her world burn. He felt her crushing loneliness, the way she had been told her beauty was a curse and her light was a sin. But beneath the fear he felt her ironclad resolve. She hadn't stayed in that cellar. She had survived. She had kept her light hidden not out of shame, but to protect the world from the very people who now held her. She didn't give up, Killian whispered, his voice gaining a jagged edge of iron. She never gave up. The despair that had weighed him down began to transmute into a white-hot, cold-burning rage. The Archduke thought he knew Killian's psychological profile. He thought he knew the limits of a vampire's heart. But the Archduke had made one fatal error. He believed the bond was just a mechanical key. He didn't understand that when a man who has lived in the dark for 5 centuries finally sees the sun, he will burn the world to the ground to keep it from going out. Killian stood up. His eyes didn't glow red. They burned with a terrifying steady silver light, the residue of Clara's essence that the Star Eater had failed to drain. He wasn't just a king anymore. He was a man with a purpose. A shadow moved in the doorway. Killian's hand flew to a discarded shard of obsidian, but he stopped. It was Sophie Thorne, her face bruised and her armor scorched. "There at the obsidian spire," she gasped, leaning against the archway. "The ritual has begun. The Archduke is using the Star Eater to siphon her life into the heart of the city. Killian, it's suicide to go there alone. The army is loyal to Julian now." "I'm not going there as a king, Sophie," Killian said, stepping into the moonlight. His presence was so commanding, so raw, that even the seasoned strategist stepped back in awe. "I'm going there as a husband. And I don't need an army to kill a traitor." Sophie looked at him, seeing the change, the way the bored king had been replaced by a force of nature. She handed him a heavy, silver-weighted sword she had salvaged from the ruins. "Then take this." "And Killian?" "The Archduke was wrong about one thing. He thought he chose her for you. But I saw her eyes before they took her. She wasn't looking at a king. She was looking at her home." A surge of power, more potent than any blood he had ever tasted, flooded Killian's veins. The turning point was here. He wasn't fighting for a throne or a council. He was fighting for the woman who had dared to show him his own soul. "Tell the people to look to the spire," Killian commanded, his voice a low rumble of thunder. "Because tonight the sun rises in the heart of the night. The king is back and he's not playing by the rules anymore. Do you think one vampire, even a king, can take on an entire army to save the woman he loves? I want to see your Team Killian, or Team Clara comments below. And if you're ready for the most epic showdown in vampire history, hit that subscribe button right now." The obsidian spire pierced the bleeding purple sky like a poisoned needle. Around its base, the legion of Julian Beaufort stood in ironclad ranks, their eyes glowing with a frenzied, artificial hunger. At the summit, the Archduke stood over a stone plinth where Clara Huntington was bound by chains of liquid shadow. The Star Eater blade was plunged into a central conduit, turning her vibrant, solar life force into a dark, pulsing miasma that spread across the city of Oakhaven. "Is this the destiny you wanted, little son?" the Archduke mocked, his hand hovering over the hilt. "To be the battery for a new world order?" Clara's breathing was shallow, her amber eyes dimming. "Come," she rasped, her voice a ghost of its former strength. "Killian is a broken man in a ruined church," the Archduke sneered. Suddenly, a roar like a collapsing mountain echoed from the base of the spire. A streak of silver-black lightning tore through the front lines of the Legion. Killian Sullivan didn't use the palace gates. He scaled the exterior of the spire with the ferocity of a primal beast, his silver-weighted sword carving a path through any guard foolish enough to stand in his way. He reached the summit in a blur of motion, landing on the obsidian platform with such force the stone cracked. His regal clothes were shredded, his chest bared and scarred, but his eyes were terrifying, burning with a light that shouldn't belong to a vampire. "Valerius." Killian's voice was a tectonic shift. "Step away from my queen." Julian Beaufort lunged forward, his heavy claymore swinging in a lethal arc. "You're a ghost, Sullivan. You have no crown." Killian didn't dodge. He caught Julian's blade with his bare, silver-glowing hand. The metal shrieked. With a flick of his wrist, Killian shattered the heavy steel as if it were glass and drove his own sword through Julian's heart. He didn't even look as the general fell over the edge into the abyss below. The Archduke's composure finally broke. He gripped the Star Eater, trying to pull it from the conduit to face Killian, but the blade was stuck, fused by the very power it was trying to drain. "You think love is a weakness?" Killian stepped toward him, the air around him vibrating with the frequency of a coming storm. "You think you picked her for me? You didn't pick her because she was plain. You picked her because you were too blind to see that she was the only thing in this world that could make me give a damn about it." Killian reached Clara, but as he touched the shadow chains, they burned him. The Star Eater was reacting to his proximity, trying to consume him too. "Killian, no!" Clara cried, her eyes snapping open. "It will kill you. The blade, it's a vacuum." "Then let it be full," Killian whispered. He didn't pull her away. Instead, he grabbed the hilt of the Star Eater alongside the Archduke. He forced his own ancient royal blood, the blood of 1,000 years of darkness, into the blade. It was a paradox. A king of shadow and a queen of light, connected through the very weapon meant to destroy them. The reaction was cataclysmic. The Star Eater couldn't handle the simultaneous input of absolute light and absolute shadow. It began to scream, the obsidian surface webbing with white-hot cracks. No. The ritual, the Archduke shrieked, but it was too late. The blade exploded. A supernova of violet and silver energy erupted from the top of the spire. A shockwave so powerful it blew the clouds from the sky and disintegrated the Archduke into nothing but ash and a lingering scent of rotting lilies. The shadow chains shattered into harmless mist. Killian caught Clara as she fell, the two of them collapsing onto the now silent stone. For a moment the world was utterly still. The purple eclipse had vanished, replaced by the natural, starlit sky. Clara opened her eyes, finding Killian's face. The silver fire in his eyes had faded, replaced by a soft, weary blue. She reached up, her thumb brushing a cut on his cheek. "You came back for the ugly chick," she whispered, a small, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I came back for my soul," Killian replied, pulling her into a kiss that tasted of victory and the first breath of a new life. Below them, the city began to glow, not with the sickly light of the ritual, but with the warm lamps of a people realized they were finally free. The High Court was gone. The council was broken. And in the wreckage of a 1,000-year-old conspiracy, a king and a queen had found the only thing that was ever real. The first rays of a true dawn began to crest over the horizon, painting the jagged peaks of the Oakhaven Mountains in hues of gold and rose. The obsidian spire, once a symbol of dread, now stood silent, a hollow monument to a fallen tyranny. Killian Sullivan carried Clara Huntington down the winding marble stairs, stepping out into the courtyard where the remnants of the city's population had gathered. The air was no longer thick with the metallic tang of fear. It smelled of pine, morning dew, and the sweet, dizzying scent of hope. As the people saw their king, not draped in the cold finery of the Shadow Throne, but scarred, bloodied, and holding a human woman with the reverence of a man holding a miracle, a profound silence fell. "The council is no more," Killian's voice rang out, carrying a new warmth that vibrated through the very stones of the square. "The age of shadows and bartered souls has ended. Today we do not build a kingdom on bloodlines. We build it on the light that saved us all." Clara stood on her own feet then, her hand slipping into Killian's. The violet sigil on her neck had settled into a faint, elegant shimmer, no longer a beacon of war, but a mark of her own reclaimed identity. She looked out at the faces of the people who had once looked past her, and she didn't see judgment. He saw wonder. In the months that followed, Oakhaven transformed. The mating auctions were abolished, replaced by a society where humans and vampires worked to bridge the gap between their worlds. Sophie Thorne took a seat as a primary advisor, ensuring that the new government was built on transparency rather than secrets. Killian and Clara didn't move back into the suffocating opulence of the royal suite. Instead, they retreated to a restored manor on the edge of the Blackwood Forest, where the trees whispered secrets of growth rather than ghosts. Killian, the man who had once sought invisibility to find peace, found that he had never been more visible or more content. One evening, as they sat on the balcony watching the stars, Killian turned to Clara. "You know," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her palm, "the Archduke thought he was a genius for putting you in that line. He thought he was playing on my cynicism." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, her amber eyes reflecting the constellations. "And what was he actually doing?" "He was giving me the only thing I didn't know I was looking for," Killian said, leaning down to press a soft kiss to her temple. "He thought he picked a girl nobody would notice. But the moment I saw you, Clara, the rest of the world simply ceased to exist." The ugly chick of the mating auction had become the heartbeat of a new era. They had been two broken pieces of a rigged game, but together they had rewritten the rules. As the sun fully rose, illuminating their joined hands, the prophecy of the Ethelgard was finally fulfilled, not through conquest but through a love that refused to be silenced. Thank you all so much for joining us on this 40-minute journey into the heart of the Shadow Kingdom. This story of Killian and Clara reminds us that our true value is never determined by those who seek to use us, but by those who truly see us. If you loved this emotional roller coaster and the victory of light over darkness, please leave a comment with the word "Unveiled," so I know you made it to the very end. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, We have so many more epic tales of mystery, romance, and supernatural twists coming your way. Until next time, stay curious and keep seeking the light.